Have you ever sat down to sew only to spend your entire time cutting and then feel too tired to even start the actual project? Someone once told me that cutting out her pieces took so long that by the time she was finished, she was exhausted, so she stopped. So the next time she had the urge to sew, she picked up another project, cut out all the pieces, got tired again, and then stopped again. And that cycle kept repeating. No finished projects, no progress, just prep work and frustration. And it's not just cutting. When you only have 30 minutes, half of your time disappears to set up, measuring, pressing, and fixing mistakes. And sewing starts to feel overwhelming instead of fun. This is especially true if you're sewing in the midst of real life, around work, kids, travel, and everything else that you want to be doing. But there are a few simple changes that can completely change how much you're able to get done in the time you have. In this video, I'm going to show you how to reduce friction, speed up sewing, and finally, how to make cutting take half the time it normally does. So even if you only have 30 minutes, you can actually finish something. Hi, I'm Victoria, and I help you sew practical, stylish accessories that are ready for real life and real adventures. Now, this video is all about giving you practical, actionable ways to actually make progress, even if sewing has to fit into the margins of a busy life. So, I've broken this down into 3 parts, starting with small changes that reduce interruptions and friction while you're sewing, then ways to speed up the construction process itself, and finally, how to speed up the most time-consuming and dreaded part of sewing, cutting and prep. I'll mention a few tools and resources along the way that directly support these time-saving tips. And I've linked everything for you in the description below so you don't have to go searching. All right, let's start with the ways to reduce interruptions and friction. First, have a dedicated sewing space. When I used to sit at my small dinner table, I'd sit down with 30 minutes. I'd spend 10 minutes setting it all up, and another 10 putting it all away. By the time I was actually ready to sew, my time was basically gone. Now everything stays exactly where I left it. I just sit down, take off the dust cover, and start. There's no setup, no breakdown, and no wasted time. Now when sewing already has to fit into a busy life, removing that barrier makes it dramatically easier to actually make progress. Now, it doesn't have to be a full sewing room. It just needs to be yours. Even just a small corner that's always ready to go can give you your time back. Next, keep your space clean and organized. This one might not sound very exciting, but it makes a bigger difference than you'd think. When your table is cluttered and you can't find what you need, you're constantly stopping to dig for tools, clear space, or move things out of the way. And those little interruptions add up fast. Having your essentials in an organized place means you can just reach for what you need and keep going. And one small thing that's made a huge difference for me is having a tiny trash can at my table. Instead of thread tails and fabric snippets piling up everywhere, I can toss them immediately and move on. It takes 2 seconds and it saves 100% of the time it would take to clean up a mess because the mess never happened in the first place. The one I use is metal, so nothing sticks to it, and it's smaller than my phone, so it just sits in the corner without getting in the way. It has a little swing top, which makes it really easy to use mid-project, and honestly, it's just one of those tiny things that makes sewing feel smoother and more enjoyable. Keeping your space clear helps you stay focused and keep your momentum. Next, keep extra bobbins on hand and keep your most used colors ready to go. I've heard of people unwinding their bobbins to reuse them for a different color, but bobbins are fairly inexpensive, and having extra means you never have to do that. You can just wind a new one and drop it into your storage container for later. I like to keep black, white, and a few common colors already wound. And I store them in a small organizer where I can see everything and grab what I need. And I don't know about you, but I get really excited when I'm about to start a project and the color I need is already there, ready to go. I can just pop it in and start sewing. I mean, winding a bobbin doesn't really take that long and it's not a big deal, but for some reason it always feels like an obstacle to me when I'm ready to start sewing. So, removing that small barrier makes it much easier to keep your momentum. Now, before we get into the steps to actually speed up the process, this next step is going to sound backwards, but it's important. And that is to slow down. Slowing down and taking your time to do things right the first time saves you more than rushing or having to fix mistakes later. I've had moments where I cut pieces together to save time, only to realize later that they were supposed to be mirrored. And now the fabric is wasted and I have to cut everything again. Or sewing something together incorrectly and spending way more time seam ripping it than it would have taken to double check it in the first place. Even things like installing cam snaps. They are incredibly hard to remove once they're in. Taking an extra minute to make sure everything is positioned correctly can save you from losing half of your afternoon trying to fix it. It feels faster to rush, but mistakes are one of the biggest hidden time drains in sewing. And slowing down just enough to be intentional protects your time and your progress. Now that we've removed a lot of the interruptions that slow you down, let's talk about ways to actually make the sewing itself faster. First, use wonder clips instead of pins wherever you can. They're much faster because instead of picking up the fabric, maneuvering a pen through the layers, and trying not to stick yourself, you just slide the clip right onto the edge, kind of like a tiny binder clip for fabric. It takes a fraction of the time and they hold everything securely without shifting. They only work on edges, so pins still have their place, but for most projects, this switch makes the prep process noticeably faster and gets you to the sewing part sooner. Next, batch your sewing and pressing when it makes sense. Sewing is mostly a step-by-step process, so you can't batch everything, but when you do have multiple pieces that need the same step, it saves time to do them all at once. For example, when I was making my organizer tote bag, several pieces needed their top edges folded and pressed. Instead of pulling the iron out over and over later, I just pressed all of them at the same time while it was already out. The same goes for things like straps or top stitching. If the pieces are ready, doing these similar steps together reduces repetition and keeps the process moving. It helps you avoid all the back and forth between tasks. And that constant shifting adds up, both physically and mentally. So working in batches helps you stay in the flow and finish faster. Next, use tools that eliminate measuring friction or the need to stop and figure things out in the middle of your project. One of the biggest time drains is constantly having to check conversions, count ruler marks, or remind yourself what a certain measurement is supposed to look like. That's exactly why I created my measurement guide. It's basically a printable reference you can keep right next to you with rulers, seam allowance templates, fabric measurements, and conversion charts all laid out clearly. So instead of stopping to Google something, count tiny tick marks, or double check your math, you can just look once and move on. It removes all of those little hesitation moments that break your focus and slow you down, especially with awkward measurements like 3/8 or 5/8 that aren't instantly obvious. Speaking of awkward measurements, one of my favorite tools for this is the seam width gauge, which is also included in the printable guide, but I love having the acrylic version at my table. It has physical tabs for each measurement, so instead of measuring and remeasuring, you just place it and mark. It makes things like boxed corners on tiny pieces or seam allowances almost instant. Tools like this remove the guesswork and help you move through your project without constantly stopping to figure things out. And if you ever make your own bias tape, a bias tape maker can save you a huge amount of time. Making your own bias tape gives you way more flexibility. You can match your fabric perfectly, use any print you want, and it often lays nicer than store-bought options. But folding and pressing it manually can be slow and tedious. A bias tape maker simplifies that completely. You just feed the fabric strip into the tool, and as you pull it along, it folds the edges automatically while you press behind it with your iron. So instead of manually folding and pressing the entire strip in multiple steps, the tool does most of the work for you in one smooth motion. It turns something that normally takes several careful passes and turns it into a quick, continuous process and saves a surprising amount of time. Now, those tips speed up sewing itself, but there's one part of the process that usually takes the most time of all: cutting and prep. Now, before we get into that, if you're finding this helpful, please give the video a like and subscribe for more practical sewing content. First, use a rotary cutter. This makes cutting dramatically faster because instead of the slow back and forth motion of the scissors, you can just glide the blade straight along your fabric and you're done. It's quicker, more precise, and makes clean, straight cuts in seconds, especially on longer pieces. And since cutting often takes more time than sewing itself, this one change can save a huge amount of time over the course of a project. Now, if you go this route, you'll need a self-healing cutting mat and an acrylic ruler to protect your surface and keep your cuts straight. I personally use a 3-piece cutting set that includes all of those, and I'll link it below if you want to see the one that I recommend. And if you want to make rotary cutting even faster, a rotating cutting mat makes a huge difference. Normally, when I'm cutting pieces, I constantly have to reposition myself or the fabric so I can keep the blade aligned correctly. I'll cut one slice, then walk around the table, then turn the fabric, and try not to shift anything while I finish the rest. But with a rotating cutting mat, I don't have to move anything. I just turn the mat and keep cutting. It saves time, keeps everything aligned, and makes the whole process feel much smoother, especially for smaller pieces and curves. It comes in multiple sizes, and I chose the 12 by 12 inch version because it fits a lot of what I cut, and I have enough space for it to rotate easily on my table. I'll link the one I used below if you want to check that out. It's one of those tools that seems optional, but when you're trying to speed up the most tedious and time-consuming part of all, it's worth it. And even with the right tools, there's a couple more habits that can make cutting go much faster. The first is batch cutting. When I start a project, I try to cut everything out at once while I'm already in that cutting mindset. Not just the main fabric pieces, but also the straps, tabs, or anything else that the project will need later. That way, when I sit down to sew, I'm not stopping to go back and cut something I forgot. Everything is already there, and I can just focus on construction. And when it makes sense, you can even cut multiple layers of fabric at the same time, like 2 identical rectangles of lining fabric, to speed things up even more. Just be careful with pieces that need to be mirrored or have a specific orientation, because it's easy to get those backwards. Thus, it can be better to cut those individually. It's a simple shift, but finishing all the cutting clears the mental clutter and lets the rest of the project move much faster. And finally, take advantage of patterns, especially free ones. Patterns save a huge amount of time because instead of marking and measuring things yourself, you can just print the piece, place it on your fabric, and cut. Even if something simple as a rectangle takes more time than you'd think, you still have to measure each side, mark it, turn your ruler, and repeat the process before you can cut. With the pattern piece, it's just cut, 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 and you're done. And the time savings become even bigger with curves, circles, or complex shapes, because someone has already done the work of figuring it out for you. So instead of spending your limited time troubleshooting, you can skip straight to creating. So when patterns are available, especially free ones, it's one of the easiest ways to save time and make the process simpler. I hope these tips help you get past the cutting part and enjoy the sewing part. Now, if you're interested in more practical tips that make sewing easier, you may want to check out this video. Thanks for watching. Bye!